Hello and welcome to the Elephant Lounge. I'm your host Tuesday. I want to thank you so much for joining me again. And we are on episode 5 of Why They Are Guilty. In my first episode, I talked about propaganda. What is it? How to identify it? In episodes 2 and 3, I presented an example of propaganda and we broke that down. And then in the last episode, I talked about fallacies and fallacious arguments that are made during propaganda. And we also touched a bit upon the cult-like behavior that is commonly found in these various online groups where you have people supporting rapists, pedophiles, and murderers. For this episode, I want to get into identifying the CSI Effect. I will talk a bit about forensic evidence. Some of this may be very familiar to you, but I want to go over those things. And then finally, we will talk about the scientific method as it pertains to solving true crime. So what is the CSI Effect? I have used this term on my podcast before. This generally is going to refer to the influence that television has upon its audience. Also, movies would be included in that. So those who consume various television shows or movies that discuss forensic evidence may have a tendency to have a distorted view about real life interpretation of forensic investigations, or they may have an unrealistic expectation of forensic evidence. I've done a bit of research on CSI Effect, and I have found no firm studies that actually confirm this effect is a wide concern among American juries. Thank goodness. So while this concern may not be widespread, it is clear that this effect does exist with certain individuals. And I would be very curious to see a study that actually targets those who are highly active in these various groups that are online where they're supporting rapists and murderers and pedophiles, because it's very clear to me that many of these people do share a common myopia of sorts as it pertains to understanding how cases are solved, real life cases, especially those that involve forensic evidence. Now, if you've ever gotten into a discussion with one of these fans, you'll find that they indeed convey many ideas that typically seem to come from a television show or a movie. And a perfect example of this that recently happened, Kathleen Zellner, who is Stephen Avery's attorney, announced very recently that a $100,000 reward is now available to any information that can point to the real killer of Teresa Halbach. So in this naked expression of I don't have anything, the fans, however, will continue to insist that Kathleen has something up her sleeve, or there's something else coming, or she's waiting for her big moment. Obviously, this could only be a belief shared among people who consume a high amount of Hollywood entertainment. The reality is, if you have a client who's sitting in prison that you know is innocent and you have more information, you put your best case forward first. You would never hold on to anything or wait for some glorious moment. That just simply wouldn't happen. And she has put her best case forward. And of course, she has nothing because Stephen Avery and Brendan Daisy are guilty as sin. The majority of cases in America are still solved with good detective work, circumstantial evidence, and physical evidence. Many cases simply do not rise to the level of needing forensic evidence. Another obstacle governments face involve funding. Many times when forensic testing is done, only a limited number of tests can be completed. So this is why wherever they choose to do their testing, it needs to be backed up with the circumstantial or physical evidence. This is why it's so important for cases that go to trial, they have that solidly backed up with the other evidence, the circumstantial and physical evidence. So let's talk a little bit about some forensic evidence. We have fingerprints. Now, fingerprints are probably one of the first tests that were introduced into our courts concerning forensic evidence. And while fingerprints can be extremely valuable to demonstrate a person was at a location they claimed never to be, there are a variety of limitations. Number one, you need a non-porous surface. Certain weather conditions or any type of environmental condition can affect the ability of lifting a print, and many prints lift lifted can often result in half prints or smeared prints, making them obsolete and unusable. The reality is, a full fingerprint requires someone to leave their hand on a non-porous surface, do so without smudging, and do so in a condition that is conducive of lifting that print. Now, with the advent of touch DNA testing, we've learned that dusting an area can sometimes interfere with doing a DNA test. So oftentimes only one test can be done. And since DNA is much more precise, this test might actually be favored over a fingerprint. I wouldn't necessarily say fingerprints are obsolete. Are they becoming obsolete? Possibly. It really is going to depend on the circumstances and the area. All of those things are going to come into play. So we have to look at all these cases individually. That's what the detectives are there to do. They're there to determine what test is going to be most helpful, most valuable. So let's get into DNA testing. There are a number of ways to obtain DNA. You can find DNA in the skin cells, which is what I just referred to, the touch DNA. It's found in blood, semen, saliva, urine, feces, hair, teeth, bone, and tissue. Now, according to national standards, 13 loci are required for a full profile. A match can be full or partial. In many cases, a partial profile can still be quite valuable. Again, it's going to be up to the juries to decide how valuable that is. Is it going to be more valuable if you have a lot of circumstantial and physical evidence? Of course. If you just have a partial profile and nothing else really surrounding that, it's probably not going to be as valuable. Now, if you have a victim or a suspect where you have a genetic profile, but their profile isn't on file, there's no known profile to compare it to, scientists can also get the sequencing of the Y chromosome, which is denoted as YSTR. This is the Y chromosome strain of the genetic material from the paternal side. So fathers, uncles, brothers, if you can get a genetic sample from them and compare that, you can then narrow down who the victim or suspect is. And also mitochondrial DNA, denoted as mtDNA. This is the maternal line, obviously, so a mother, a sister, or an aunt can be helpful in identifying either a suspect or a victim. It'll just depend on what the sex of the victim is. Now let's talk a little bit about the scientific method. I'm sure we've all heard what the scientific method is, but I want to go over the steps that are involved in scientific method. It's going to first start with making observations and data collection. When someone is investigating a crime, they're going to want to make various observations about either behavior or environment, and then you have data collection, physical evidence, things like a will, a paper trail, and then you have the forensic evidence. So all of these things need to be collected. Fortunately, for those of us who follow true crime in the news, for instance, or we watch these various propaganda pieces, all of this stuff has already been done for us, but it's up to us to make sure that we're looking at primary resources like court transcripts, police reports, scientific reports. We look at that data for ourselves so that we know what information detectives have. Then from there, they create a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is basically your best guess as to who was involved in the crime. If we're talking about murder, you're trying to identify a suspect, and you may even try to find how the murder took place, where the murder took place, various things like that. You go ahead and you create this hypothesis, but you always do so using the facts and the data that's been given to you. The main point that I really want to stress here is if you're creating a hypothesis, you want to be following the evidence, not leading the evidence. When I talked about propaganda previously, what propaganda attempts to do is they try to get you to an end point that so-and-so is innocent. And if they can get you to that point, then any information, any data or observations that are made, the person who is consuming the propaganda will instantly begin to observe those various data points through a lens of this person is innocent, and it will cause them to reject or excuse any information that is contradictory to that person being innocent. Now, the next thing to do is to test the hypothesis. There are a number of ways to do this, but ultimately what you're doing is taking the evidence that you have and putting it up against the hypothesis and seeing if that information matches. If new information or data comes in and you find that it is not fitting with the hypothesis, then you must change your angle and create a new one. And this might mean starting over at the very beginning. Finally, we interpret results and we form a conclusion. We interpret everything that has happened. We interpret what has been tested, and then we form a conclusion. We decide, okay, this is who I think did it, and this is what backs my analysis up. So let's get into some examples of true crime, and we're going to talk about the scientific method. When a crime is reported, police, they work for the public, so their job is going to first believe you or whoever is reporting a crime. Let's look at the Jessi Small case. Now, I covered this case a little bit, and here we have a case where a crime was reported. This was a hate crime where Jessi claimed he was attacked by MAGA hat wearing Trump supporters. They physically attacked him. A cord was placed around his neck and bleach was poured on him. Chicago, minus 20 degrees. And while the police did initially admit they had some skepticism, their job was to prove what Jessi claimed happened. This was the hypothesis that they worked with. So in this case, typically what an investigator will do is they will go ahead and go with that narrative. That gives them a place to start and begin their investigation, to test the facts. They can move directly into testing everything against that narrative that was given to them. But as the facts began to come in, they did not fit with the initial story given to them, and they had to readjust. And again, they followed the evidence. The case unraveled rather quickly, especially when they were finally able to question the two suspects that had been identified. Ultimately, their final conclusion was that Jessi had staged this attack for the purposes of gaining attention with the possibility of saving his job. Now, there's still more things to come with that case. I'll be interested in seeing how that all plays out, but based on the evidence and following the evidence, police were able to come to that conclusion. Another perfect example that incorporates the CSI effect would be the Casey Anthony case. Now, the jury members who were questioned after their verdict, they were really stuck on this idea of, well, we don't know how Kaylee died. Well, that's not the question the jury should have been concerned with. There have been many murder cases in America where we haven't even found a body, so we have no idea how that person died, but we know that they're gone. We know that this person committed the crime. They were asked if Casey was responsible for the death of her child. Did she murder her child? Of course she did. The fact that the jury was so concerned with how she did something, or somehow they weren't satisfied with the forensic evidence, this tells me that this jury got a lot of ideas from not the real world, not a real world courtroom situation, but possibly from television. They didn't seem to understand what their duty was. It was to take the information given to them and determine whether it was Casey who murdered her daughter daughter. Now, if you look at the coroner, for instance, what did she do? She used the scientific method. She had skeletal remains that were found in a laundry bag, in a trash bag. There was duct tape that was placed over this child's mouth. Now, she didn't know how this child had died specifically, but considering the circumstances, coupled with the behavior of a mother who didn't report her child missing for 31 days, who went out and partied and had no affect when police had questioned her and confronted her with her lies. I mean, this girl lied and lied repeatedly. And again, no affect. If we consider all of these details and evidence, the coroner was able to conclude that the cause of death was a homicide. I mean, you have a young child. She wasn't suffering from heart disease or leukemia or diabetes. She was a healthy little girl. She's not going to die of natural causes. She died because it was a homicide. That is using the scientific method. For whatever reason, and I would propose it would be the CSI effect, this jury was trying to answer questions that were not needed to determine that Casey was responsible for the death of her daughter. If we look at the Stephen Avery case, let's go back to that real quick. The evidence is quite clear. We have circumstantial evidence, physical evidence, and forensic evidence. Now, this is just a quick list of what was discovered. This is in no way an exhaustive list. We have the circumstantial evidence, which would include Stephen was the last person to see Teresa. Stephen lied initially about her arriving at the property. Teresa previously mentioned an uncomfortable feeling and situation when she initially went to the Avery property. He answered the door in only a towel. Stephen initially lied about having a bonfire the night Teresa went missing. And then, of course, we have Brendan's confession. Physical evidence. This would include telephone records. We know Avery called her using *69 and even booked his appointment under Barb's name. He even called after she left to try and establish an alibi. We have the burned aftermath of her phone, PDA, and camera in Avery's burn barrel. We have human bones that were found in Avery's burn pit. Witnesses confirmed he indeed had a bonfire that night. The bonfire was confirmed. Brendan's bleach-stained pants that were shoved in the back of his closet. The garage was indeed confirmed to have been cleaned. A bullet was found inside Avery's garage, and that linked to his gun specifically through a ballistics expert. Avery has a large visible cut on his hand when police question him. Forensic evidence. We have bones found in a burn pit linked to Teresa Hallback. Bullet found inside Avery's garage linked to his gun had Teresa's DNA on it. Avery's blood was found in Teresa's wrap. Avery's touch DNA was found both on the hood latch of Teresa's vehicle as well as the key to her vehicle, which was found in a nightstand inside his trailer. Luminol made a positive hit inside Avery's garage, and this was in the location per the confession of Brendan Daisy. Now, I gotta say, most murder cases rarely have this much evidence. I mean, to put it bluntly, the evidence here is so overwhelming, and this is just the stuff I remember off the top of my head. And rather than accepting the evidence for what it is and realizing that none of this same evidence points to anybody else being involved, we have Making a Murderer and its supporters going out of their way to avoid acknowledging it. Instead, what they do is they excuse it or make poor attempts to explain the evidence, saying it was planted. This is clearly a demonstration of the CSI effect, where they have consumed this propagandist material, which is Making a Murderer. The propagandist piece was able to push them to a conclusion, which is that Stephen and Brendan are innocent, and then that way any of the evidence that comes in, they can now see that through the lens of, oh, they're innocent, and they're going to hold on to that conclusion no matter what. So essentially what they're doing is they're leading the evidence. They're not allowing the evidence to lead them. This is so very important. So let's talk about the scientific method as it's used in the laboratory. Let's go back a little bit. This would be inside a lab, a basic laboratory experiment, especially in organic chemistry. I think they even do one of these in the 101 level. So you're given an unknown solid, and you must identify this unknown solid by performing a series of tests. So this is where we go into our data collection, and these tests include observations, texture, weight, color, smell. We move on to solubility tests. What kind of solution, aqueous solution, will your compound dissolve in? Will it be water? Will it be sodium hydroxide? Then you move on to like a flame test. Another test that can be done is IR spectrum. This is infrared spectroscopy. Essentially what it does is it helps determine the types of bonds that are inside that chemical, and they report on a chart. And then we have like bromine and permanganate tests and a Tollens test. These are all different tests to determine what's inside your compound. Now, you use the results of these tests, and then you can compare your sample with known information about known solids. Based on your tests, you're able to determine what types of carbon bonding you have in your unknown solid. Let's say it's a ketone or an aldehyde. That would be an example. Now, you'll be able to easily navigate your way through the tests and narrow down the compounds with which you should compare your known compounds with, and ultimately you'll be able to identify your compound. And then you'll hand that in and they'll give you another compound and you do the whole series over again. So let's take a quick look at how absurd a Michael Jackson fan is at this point in the conversation. All right, using the scientific method. All right, let's look at the case as it is. It's not a murder case. It is a case of child molestation. And in this case specifically, we have a child predator who groomed children and parents over many years. And it just so happened to be a huge celebrity. Now, we cannot expect forensic evidence. Instead, a case like this is going to have to be built upon testimony, circumstantial evidence, and that I also include behavior and physical evidence. The first test we must complete would be to compare the suspect with other known pedophiles. Now, in my podcast entitled Profile of a Pedophile, I clearly demonstrate that Michael Jackson indeed fit all the known characteristics of a grooming pedophile, down to a T. The characteristics were focused on the behavioral aspects of identifying a pedophile. And again, I cannot stress to you enough, he hit every single mark. Now let's look at the other evidence that we have. Again, this is not going to be an exhaustive list. At this point, we have 25 years of various accusations, all similar claims that Michael Jackson molested children, mostly young boys from ages 7 to 14. The majority of these claims are quite consistent and involve the grooming of parents as well. We know for a fact that MJ spent the majority of his time hanging out with children. This is well documented in the media, on television, during award shows. Everywhere Michael was, he was with a little boy, reported by family, friends, and his staff members. Michael Jackson publicly used the language of known pedophiles. Children are heavenly and godlike. Sharing your bed. Sharing your bed is the most loving thing you can do. Okay, and that's in the context of children sharing his bed. Not adults, children. Gavin even states on national television, Michael Jackson told him, "If you love me, you'll sleep in my bed." That is the language of a pedophile. By Michael's own admission, he shared his bed with young boys during his sexual prime years. Michael was absolutely a sexual person. He was not this asexual person that some people like to claim. His dancing consistently and repeatedly included what would become a signature move, grabbing his crotch. And he did this in front of children as well. He owned an extensive pornography collection that just so happened to include books commonly found among other known pedophiles. We know Michael's penis was identified correctly by Jordan Chandler. We know he paid out millions of dollars to silence both Jordan and Jason Francia. We have a slew of various witnesses that include his staff members that confirm Michael Jackson had naked pics of at least 2 of his special friends and had witnessed Michael Jackson and young boys in various compromising positions. These include groping, kissing, and being naked together. When we consider the totality of these facts, there is but one logical conclusion. He was indeed a pedophile, yet we still have these remaining people who want to ignore these facts and say Michael Jackson did nothing wrong. He's a dindu. Now imagine, if you will, for a moment, a chemistry student. They are given an unknown solid, and after doing all the required basic tests and continuing to do even more tests in order to confirm they have a certain compound, let's say all the tests show that the unknown is a certain carboxylic acid. A carboxylic acid has certain characteristics, so it's going to react with these tests in a particular way. Yet the student has decided that they're going to report that they found an alcohol. Now, the first question of this student by the professor would likely be, why'd you decide to report your unknown was an alcohol when it's clear from the test that you performed, your unknown was a carboxylic acid? And the student replies that the unknown they were given, it was switched out by a sinister fellow student, and their tests were altered by other students who were conspiring against them. So the professor would obviously ask, well, what evidence do you have for all of these accusations? I mean, how do you know this happened? And the student replies that they just know, and that the students were jealous of them and wanted to attack him or her. They present no evidence for any of these accusations, but it's just their own paranoia and feelings. And they also claim they spoke with the other students and they just know something was sketchy about them. Now, clearly, anyone can see how ludicrous this situation would be if this were to play out in a real-life situation. Yet, this is the same mentality that we witness continuously with Michael Jackson fans. We've done all the tests. We have all the facts. We see what this is because we're following the evidence. Okay, same thing with the Stephen Avery supporters, Amanda Knox fans, West Memphis 3, you name it. The list is growing all the time with every new propaganda piece we see that supports these people that are so clearly guilty of their crimes. We have to remember to follow the evidence, not poke holes in it, not dictate it, not change it. We cannot arrive at our conclusion until we've actually followed the evidence. Now, in the next episode, I am going to be presenting to you a real case where someone was indeed convicted of a crime they did not commit. And in doing so, we will compare and contrast the differences of how this case fell apart in a very glorious way, I might add. And we will examine the differences between what a true narrative is and merely attempting to poke holes in a case where a narrative has been correctly established. Please be on the lookout for that. I will be starting on that right away, and I will be back.